Welcome, students. Today, we will start with NCERT exercise of chapter 17, that is locomotion and movement. This is disclaimer. So, this will be our learning objective. We will explore and understand the fundamental concepts of this chapter, which is locomotion and movement, by working through the NCERT questions. This is our index. So, we will complete question number 1 to question number 10 of NCERT exercise of this chapter, which is locomotion and movement. Let's see the first question, and the question is, draw the diagram of a sarcomere of skeletal muscle showing different regions. So we know that sarcomere is the basic unit of skeletal muscle. It is kind of a single brick in a wall. So talking about its function, it is mainly responsible for muscle contraction, which let us move our bodies. Let's see the answer in detail. We also know that sarcomere is divided into distinct regions, each with a specific role in muscle contraction. We will see the details one by one. So this is the actual diagram. Here you can see the A band, I band, H zone, M zone and N line, which are clearly marked. These regions help the sarcomere contract as well as relax just like gears working together in a machine. So remember, the arrangement of these bands is what allows our muscles to shorten and produce movement. So this is our second question, and the question is about sliding filament theory. So the question is, define sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. Let's see the answer. We know that this theory explains how muscle contract to produce movement. Okay, so imagine this as a process where different parts inside the muscle slide past each other, causing the muscle to shorten and generate force. So let's get a bit more specific. In this process, thin filaments made up of actin slide past thick filaments made up of myosin. This sliding action shortens the sarcomere, which is the basic unit of muscle contraction. So it's like pulling the two ends of a rope closer together to make it even shorter. Now let's talk about the mechanism behind this process. The first step is signal arrival. So when your brain wants its muscle to contract, it sends a nerve impulse to the muscle. This triggers the release of calcium ions inside the muscle cell, which acts like a green light to start the contraction process. So here you can see different stages of cross bridge formation. So first, actin filament binds with myosin filament. This leads to formation of cross bridge, which further leads to power stroke, or we can say sliding or rotation of the filaments, which further leads to detachment. That is, here myosin filament and actin filament detaches with each other, leading to breakage of cross bridge. Now let's focus specifically on binding. The calcium ions allow the myosin heads to attach to specific sites on the actin filaments. So you can think of this like a key unlocking a door, allowing the myosin to grab into the actin and getting ready to pull. Now comes cross bridge formation. As we can see from the diagram, the myosin heads actually latch into the actin, forming what we call it as cross bridge. So this is somewhat like hands grabbing a rope, preparing to pull it along. So this connection is essential for muscle to generate force as well as contraction. Let's break down the mechanism behind the processes. The first key step here is the power stroke. Okay, power stroke, which we already discussed in that diagram. So you can imagine here the myosin heads inside the muscle fiber as little rowers on a boat. So they grab onto the actin filaments and get ready to pull, just like rowers preparing to move their oars. Now during the power stroke, These myosin heads pivot and pull the actin filaments toward the center of the sarcomere, which is the basic unit of a muscle. So it's like the rowers pulling their oars through the water, bringing the boat forward. And this movement is what actually shortens the muscle. Now, this pulling action is what we call the power stroke. It's the main force that drives muscle contraction. So remember, every time you move your arm or leg, millions of these power strokes are happening inside your muscles. So we have already talked about this diagram, which is showing formation of cross bridge. Now, after the power stroke, the next step is detachment. The myosin head need to let go of the actin so they can reset and start the process again. So you can think of it like the rowers lifting their oars out of the water to get ready for the next stroke. Now, a new ATP binds to the myosin head, causing it to detach from the actin filament. So ATP is like the fuel that allows the myosin to get go and prepare for another round of pulling. So without ATP, the myosin would stay stuck and the muscle couldn't be able to relax. Now, finally, the myosin head resets to its original position, ready to start the cycle again. Now, this continuous cycle of attachment, pulling, detachment, and resetting is what allows our movement to contract smoothly as well as repeatedly. So, let remember that this process is happening every time we move from blinking our eyes to running a race. Now, this is question number 3, and the question is describe the important steps in muscle contraction. So, you know that this is a key process in how our bodies move from walking to picking up objects. So, let's identify the starting point, that is the signaling. The signal for muscle contraction. Okay, so just like a runner waits for the starting pistol, our muscles need a signal to start contracting, and this signal comes from our nervous system, which acts as body's communication network. Here we can see that the CNS, or we can say central nervous system, sends a signal through a motor neuron. You can imagine the CNS as the control center sending instructions down the wires of our nerves to the muscle. So this is the first step in getting the muscle ready to contract. Next, the signal reaches a special connection point called as neuromuscular junction. So you can think of this as a handshake between the nerve and muscle. It's where the message from the nerve is passed on to the muscle fiber, setting the stage for the next steps. Now, this image helps us visualize the neuromuscular junction. You can notice how the nerve ending comes very close to the muscle fiber but doesn't actually touch it. And this tiny gap is where important chemical signals are exchanged, allowing the process to continue. Here you can see different steps like how acetylcholine release and leads to binding to the receptor. Then afterwards, action potential generates, which reaches T tubule. After that, sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium ion, which is a very important step. Now, active site which further leads to active site exposure, and this leads to formation of cross bridge. Okay, here actin and myosin filament binds. Now these whole steps leads to contraction of the muscle. This is from where contraction begins. So you have to remember this picture, which is showing contraction of muscle. Now let's talk about specifically neurotransmitter release. When the nerve signal arrives at the end of neuron, it triggers the release of special chemicals. We can call it as neurotransmitters. These act like messengers carrying the signal across the gap to the muscle. Specifically, the neurotransmitter involved here is acetylcholine. We have already seen in this diagram. So it's released from the nerve ending and quickly travels across the synaptic gap. So you can think of acetylcholine as a key that unlocks the next step in the muscle activation. Once acetylcholine binds to the muscle cell membrane, it generates an action potential in the sarcolemma, which is the muscle's outer layer. So this is like flipping a switch that tells the muscle fiber to get ready for contraction. It's a crucial step in turning the nerve signal into actual movement. So third step, The third step in muscle contraction is called as the action potential. Okay, so you can think of it as electrical signal, like a message being sent down a wire that tells the muscle it's time to contract. Now, this action potential is generated in the sarcolemma, which is the outer membrane of the muscle fiber. So, you can imagine the sarcolemma as the skin of the muscle cell where the signal first appears. Once the action potential is created, it spreads throughout the entire muscle fiber. It's like a wave traveling across a pond when you throw it in a stone. The signal moves quickly to make sure the whole muscle gets the message at the same time. So we have already talked about the different steps that is involved in contraction of muscle. Next, talk about calcium ion. So the major step here it is calcium ion release. Calcium here acts like a key that unlocks the machinery inside the muscle, allowing contraction to happen. Now the action potential travels down into the muscle cell and reaches the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which you can think of as a storage warehouse for calcium ions. This is where the signal tells the cell to release its stored calcium. As a result, calcium ions are released into the sarcoplasm, the fluid inside the muscle cell. These calcium ions are crucial as they start the actual process that makes the muscle fiber slide and contract, just like turning on the engine of the car. So we will continue how these calcium leads to final steps of muscle contraction. So the next important step is unmasking active sites. Imagine the muscle fibers as a locked door, and for contraction to happen, we need to unlock it. So this step sets the stage for actual interaction between the proteins that drive muscle movement. So you can see the pictures which is showing contraction of muscle as well as mechanism of cross bridge formation. Let's focus on calcium ion. When their concentration increases inside the muscle cell, they bind to specific part of troponin protein, which is called as troponin C. So you can think of calcium as a key that fits into a lock, triggering the next steps in the process. So once calcium binds to troponin C, it causes the entire troponin complex to change its shape, a bit like how a switch flips when you press it. So this change is crucial because it sets off a chain reaction, allowing the muscle to prepare for contraction. As a result of this shape change, the binding sites on the actin filament where myosin attaches are exposed. So it's like opening a gate so the myosin can grab into acting and start pulling, which is actual movement part of muscle contraction. This exposure is essential for muscle to contract efficiently. Let's focus on cross bridge formation and contraction of the muscle fiber. This is a crucial step where actual movement begins. So you can imagine this as two hands reaching out to grab each other. This connection is what allows the muscle to pull and contract. Here, the myosin head, which is energized by breakdown of ATP into ADP and phosphate, attaches to the active site on the actin filament. So you can think of ATP as a fuel that powers the myosin head, like winding up a toy car before it moves. So this energy is necessary for the myosin to grab into actin. Now this attachment forms what we call as cross bridge between thin filament, which is actin, and thick filament, which is myosin. So you can picture this like a hook latching into a rope. This connection is very essential for the muscle to generate force and start pulling. Next, the myosin head pivots, pulling the attached actin filament toward the center of the A band. It's similar to rowing a boat. Each stroke pulls the oar, or you can say actin closure, moving the boat, that is muscle fiber here, forward. Now, this movement is what actually shortens the muscle. As actin filaments are pulled inward, the Z lines which are attached to these actins also move closer together. So you can think of Z lines like the ends of a rubber band where you pull the middle, the ends come closer, shortening the whole band. Now, this entire process results in shortening of the sarcomere, which is the basic unit of muscle fiber, leading to muscle contraction. So, just like pulling both ends of a rope brings them closer, the muscle fiber contracts and creates movement. Now, this is a key takeaway that muscle contraction happens because of these coordinated steps at the microscopic level. Now, this is question number 4, and the question is write true or false. If false, change the statement so it is true. And first statement that is given is actin is present in thin filament, which is absolutely true. Talking about actin, it is actually the main building block of the thin filaments in the muscle cells. So you can think of actin as the threads that make up these filaments, kind of like the strands in a rope. So this is a key point to remember when you are studying how muscles contract. Now these thin filaments made up of actin are part of contractile apparatus in muscle cells. In other words, they are essential for the muscle's ability to contract and produce movement, just like the moving parts in a machine. So you can see uh, uh, the picture of actin, or we can say thin filament. You can see the location of troponin, how it is present in between the chain of tropomyosin and F-actin. Now, the thin filaments are specifically made up of filamentous actin, which is also called as F-actin. Now, this form of actin is like a long chain which gives the filamented structure and strength. So, you can imagine beads strung together to form a necklace. Now, filamentous actin is a polymer of globular actin, or we can say monomers, along with regulatory proteins like tropomyosin and troponin. This is important. Now this is statement 2, and it is H zone of striated muscle fiber represent both thick and thin filaments. So this is false. Let's see why. Talking about H zone, it is a central region within the A band of sarcomere that contains only thick, or we can say myosin filament, but no actin, or we can say thin filaments. Okay, so it contains only thick filaments. You can see the picture showing different components of sarcomere. Here you can see the H zone, which is in the center area, and it is present within the A band of the sarcomere. And you can see here that it only contains thick, or we can say myosin filaments, and it has no actin, or we can say thin filaments. Now this is statement 3, and see, and this is human skeletal has 206 bones. This is true. Why? So in this table we can see we have the axial skeleton, which includes the skull, vertebral column, sternum, ribs. So you can think of this as the central core of our body. The appendicular skeleton includes the limbs and girdles like the arms, legs, shoulders, and hips, and these are what let us move around. So when you add up both divisions, you get a total of 206 bones in a human adult body. So the answer here is true. So you can see axial as well as appendicular parts in skeletal system. Now this is statement D, and it is there are 11 pairs of ribs in men, which is false. Let's see why. So there are 12 pair of ribs in a man, not 11. And we can look at this diagram of the rib cage. You can notice how the ribs are arranged in pairs, and you can, if you count them, you will find out that there are 12 pairs on each side. Okay, so there are true ribs, that is 1 to 7 are true ribs, 8 to 10 are false ribs, and 11 to 12 are floating ribs. Okay, and in the center you can see sternum, and at the back we have vertebral column. So this statement was false. Now this is question number okay, it is 4, and this is E statement, and the statement is sternum is present on the ventral side of the body. Let's see the answer. So this is true. Let's see why. Talking about ventral, in biology, ventral refers to the front, or we can say belly side of the body. For humans, that's the same side as your chest and stomach is. So it's important to know these directional terms because they help us describe where organs and bones are actually found in our body. Now let's focus on sternum itself. The sternum, also called the breastbone, is indeed located on the ventral side of the body. So you can, if you touch the center of your chest, that's where your sternum is. This confirm that that this given statement is correct. So you can see the picture. You can see at the center a flat bone which is sternum. Okay, and we have rib cages, and there are three types of ribs, which are true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs, that we have already talked about in our past slide. So the sternum is a flat bone and is positioned right, it is positioned right in the center of the chest. So you can think of it like a shield that sits at the front, protecting important organs. So its flat shape helps its cover and safeguard the important organs like heart and lungs. Like, to sum up, we can say the sternum forms the front part of the rib cage and plays an important role in protecting vital organs like lungs and heart. So the statement is true, that is, the sternum is present on the ventral side of the body. So remember this when thinking about how skeleton protect us from any kind of injury. This is question number 5, and the question is about differentiation. Okay, we have to know the difference between actin and myosin. Let's see the answer one by one. Let's talk about actin first. Actin is a thin contractile protein, while myosin is a thick filament, or we can say contractile protein. So you can see from the images that actin and myosin look quite different. So think of actin as a thin rope and myosin as a thick cable. Actin is found in the light bands of the muscle fibers called as I bands, or we can say isotropic bands. And myosin is in the dark bands, or we can say A band, which is also known as anisotropic bands. This particular arrangement is what allows our muscles to contract and relax, just like the coordinated movement of ropes and pulleys in a machine. So always remember these prime differences between thick and thin filament, or we can say myosin and actin. Now the second difference is between red and white muscles. Let's see the answer. So you can see red muscles have a lot of myoglobin and mitochondria, making them look reddish and allowing them to use oxygen efficiently for long, steady activities like marathons, runners, muscles. In contrast, we can say that white muscles have less myoglobin and fewer mitochondria, so they appear pale and are better for quick, powerful bursts like sprinters' muscles. So think of red muscles as the endurance team and white muscles as the speed team in your body. Also pay attention to the differences in how they produce energy. Like, red muscles use aerobic respiration, and white muscles rely more on anaerobic respiration. Okay, so first difference is red muscle fibers have high myoglobin content that make them look red, and white muscles, they possess very less quantity of myoglobin. Second difference is they appears reddish due to myoglobin pigment. Talking about red muscle fibers, they appear red as they have myoglobin pigment. And white muscles appear white because they don't have, or we can say they have less quantity of myoglobin pigment. Third is in red muscle fibers, there are lesser sarcoplasmic reticulum, and in white muscle fibers, amount of sarcoplasmic reticulum is usually high. Talking about red muscle fibers, it contains lots of mitochondria. Okay, and white muscle fibers, they have less number of mitochondria. Now the next difference is in red muscle fibers, there are large number of mitochondria at they utilize large amount of oxygen stored in them for ATP production. Okay, and white muscle fibers, they cannot use large amount of oxygen due to less storage of it, and which further leads to less ATP production. Now, red muscle fibers, it is associated with aerobic, or we can say it is called as aerobic muscles because it is associated with aerobic respiration. And talking about white muscle fibers, it is called as anaerobic muscles, and as it is associated with anaerobic respiration. So you always remember this difference between red and white muscle fibers. The next is pectoral and pelvic girdle. So let's start with pectoral girdle. It is where our four limbs or arms attach, and it's made up of mainly two types of cells, that is clavicle, which is your collarbone, and scapula, or we can say shoulder blade. In contrast, the pelvic girdle is where our hind limbs, or we can say legs, attach, and it is made up of three bones, that is ilium, pubis, and ischium. Notice the images. These helps you see exactly where each girdle is located and how they are structured. So that you can think of pectoral girdle as the shoulder harness for your arms, while pelvic is like a sturdy belt that supports your legs and helps bear the weight of your body. Now this is question number 6, and question is match the following. We have to match column 1 with column 2 correctly. Let's see the answer. Here you can see A is matched with 4, that is involuntary. B is matched with 3, 2, that is thin filament. C matched with 1, which is myoglobin, and D matched with set third, which is Thachers. So first, let's focus on smooth muscles. Okay, smooth muscle is a type of muscle found in various parts of our body, like the walls of our digestive tract and blood vessels. Unlike skeletal muscle, we don't consciously control smooth muscle movements as they happen automatically. Now, these muscles are called as involuntary because we can't decide when to use them. For example, you don't have to think about moving food through your stomach or controlling the diameter of your blood vessels. Your body does it for you. So, this is similar to how automatic doors open and close without you needing to push a button. So this works automatically. Now, smooth muscles are found in organs such as the stomach and bladder. So think about how your stomach churns food or how your bladder holds and releases urine. And these actions are managed by smooth muscle working behind the scenes, keeping your body functioning smoothly without you having to think about it. Now, let's talk about tropomyosin. This is a term you might have seen when studying muscle structure. Now, tropomyosin is actually a protein that forms part of the thin filament in muscle fibers. So, think of the thin filament as one of the ropes that help muscles contract, and tropomyosin is like a thread woven into that rope, playing a crucial role in the structure. But tropomyosin doesn't just sit there. It helps regulate muscle contraction. Imagine it as a gatekeeper that controls when the muscle can contract by covering or uncovering binding sites for another protein called as myosin. This regulation is essential for precise muscle movement. Now let's move on to red muscle cell. Now this type of muscle is different from others because its color and function. Okay, they do have specific pigments. Now, red muscles are packed with myoglobin, which is the pigment that make it appear red, which is a protein that stores oxygen. Now, you can think of myoglobin as a mini oxygen tank inside the muscle, allowing it to keep working even when oxygen levels drop. Now, because of all that myoglobin, red muscles can keep going for a long time without getting tired. This is why they are great for activities that need endurance, like long distance running or swimming. Let's talk about skull. This is a structure everyone is familiar with. Let's see what makes it unique in terms of its connection. Now, the skull is a bony structure that protects our brain, acting like a helmet. So, it is made up of several bones that fit together tightly to keep our brain safe from any kind of injury. Now, the bones of the skull are joined by sutures, which are like seams that doesn't move. These immovable joints keep the skull rigid and strong, ensuring our brain stays protected. Now that wraps up our matching. So notice how each term connects to the specific function or we can say structure in the body. So always remember these points. Now this is question number 7, and the question is, what are the different types of movement exhibited by the cells of the human body? Let's see the answer. The first type of movement we will discuss is amoeboid movement. This is named after the amoeba, a single cell organism that moves in a very unique way. Let's see what makes this movement special. Now, amoeboid movement uses structures called as pseudopod, which actually means false feet. So imagine the cell pushing out parts of its body to crawl forward, kind of like how a blob of jelly might ooze along a surface. Now, the process involves the cell extending and retracting its cytoplasm, which is the jelly substance, or we can structure inside the cell. So, you can think of it as the cell flowing its inside forward to move, almost like squeezing toothpaste from a tube. So, here you can see a diagrammatic view of amoeboid movement. So you can see the cortex region, which is the outer cytoplasm. It's contained gel with actin network. Then you can see here inner cytoplasm, where here the gel is present with actin subunits, and further we can see the extending part, which is called as pseudopodium, that's helped them to move. Okay, so this is this diagrammatic view is showing how amoeboid movement takes place. Now, this movement is especially important for several types of cells and processes in our body. Let's look at some real life examples where this movement plays a crucial role. First, WBCs, or we can say white blood cells, use amoeboid movement to catch and engulf pathogens. So you can think of them as security guards patrolling and capturing intruders in our body. Now, macrophages, another type of immune cell, also move through tissues using this method. They act like the cleanup crew moving around to find and digest debris, or we can say dead cells. Now, amoeboid movement is also vital for wound healing and tissue repair. So, when you get a cut, cells move to the site to help close the wound and start the healing process. Interestingly, cancer cells can use amoeboid movement to migrate through the tissues. This is one way they can spread from one part of the body to another, which is why understanding this movement is important in cancer research. The second type of movement is ciliary movement. Cilia are tiny hair-like structures on the surface of certain cells. So you can think of them like tiny oars that help move things along, much like rowers moving a boat through the water. Now, ciliary movements involve the synchronized beating of these cilia. Imagine a stadium wave where everyone stands up and sits down in a pattern. Cilia beat together in a coordinated way to move substances efficiently across cell surfaces. So you can see in this picture back and front beating. This shows particular ciliary movement, and you can also see the structure of basal body here. Now let's see where ciliary movement is important in our body. Cilia have several key functions in different organs and systems. So we will go through it one by one. Now, in this respiratory tract, cilia move mucus that tracks dust and bacteria upward away from the lungs. So, it's like an escalator that constantly cleans our airways, helping to protect us from infections and keeping our lungs clear. Now, in female reproductive system, cilia in the fallopian tubes help move the egg cell towards the uterus. So, you can think of this as a conveyor belt gently carrying the egg to where it needs to go for possible fertilization. Now, in the middle ear, cilia help clear away the debris. This is important for keeping our hairs healthy and preventing infections, much like how a janitor keeps a building clean by sweeping away dirt. In the brain, cilia in the ventricles move cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid cushions the brain and removes waste, so the cilia act like tiny pedals, keeping everything flowing smoothly. One interesting fact is that cilia beat very quickly, about 10 to 20 times every second. This rapid movement is what makes them so effective at moving substances, even though each cilium is extremely small. Let's focus on third type of movement, which is muscular movement. This is a type of movement most people think of when they imagine moving their legs or arms. So muscular movement is what allows us to perform actions like running, jumping, or even just picking up a pencil. Muscular movement is based on something called as sliding filament theory. So imagine muscles as a set of tiny ropes that slide past each other to create movement, much like how pulling on the ropes of the pulley system lifts a weight. This sliding action is what actually causes our muscles to contract as well as relax. Let's see types of muscular movement. The first type here is skeletal muscle. These are the muscles attached to our bones and they help us move our body parts voluntarily. For example, when you decide to wave your hand or kick a ball, you are using your skeletal muscle. Next, we have smooth muscle. These muscles are found in our internal organs like the stomach and intestines, and they work automatically without us thinking about it. For instance, when food moves through the digestive system, it's smooth muscle doing the job. Now, the third type is cardiac muscle, which is found only in the heart. Cardiac muscles contract rhythmically and continuously to pump blood throughout the body. So, you can think of it as the engine that keeps our circulatory system running. So, this is a picture which is showing how muscle contraction takes place. To sum up, muscular movement, both voluntary and involuntary, controls everything from how we move our bodies to how our organs function. It also regulates things like blood vessel diameter and the movement of food through the digestive tract. Understanding these types of movement helps us appreciate how complex and coordinated our bodies works. Now this is question number 8, and question is, how do you distinguish between a skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle? Let's see the answer. Talking about skeletal muscle, these are unbranched like straight sticks, while cardiac muscles are branched almost like tree branches connecting together. Intercalated discs, which help heart cells communicate and contract together, are only found in cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscles show clear light and dark bands and are under our voluntary control, meaning we can move them when we want, like lifting a book. Now, cardiac muscles, on the other hand, have faint bands and work involuntarily, beating on their own without us thinking about it. Now, also, skeletal muscles can get tired quickly, but cardiac muscles are built to keep working without fatigue, just like your heart keeps beating all the day and night. So, you can take a look at this diagram to see the differences between these muscles. Now, this is question number 9, and the question is, name the type of joint between the following. We have to name the type of joint that is present between these components. Let's see one by one. First one is atlas and axis. Second is carpal metacarpal of thumb. Third one is between the phalanges. Fourth one is femur or acetabulum. Fifth one is between cranial bones. And sixth one is between pubic bones in the pelvic girdle. Let's see the answer. Let's first talk about atlas and axis, which are the first two vertebrae in your neck. This is called a pivotal joint. So imagine the way your heads turn up from side to side, like when you shake your head to say no. That's thanks to this pivotal joint acting like a rotating axis. Now next, consider the joint between carpal and metacarpal of your thumb. This is a saddle joint. So think of how your thumb can move in many directions, allowing you to grasp object. So it's almost like the thumb is getting on a saddle, giving it a wide range of movement. Now let's look at joints between phalanges, which are the bones in your fingers and toes. These are the hinge joints. Just like a door hinge, these joints allow movement in one direction. So you can bend and straighten your fingers, not just twist them. So you can see this diagram which is showing different types of synovial joints. So let's focus on D part, which is the joint between femur and acetabulum. This is called as this kind of the joint between them is ball and socket joint. So think of it like a joystick or the shoulder joint. It allows movement in almost every direction, which is why when you swing or your leg or around in a uh, or you can say you can easily swing your leg around in a circle. This type of joint gives us a lot of flexibility as well as range of motion. Now let's look at the joints between the cranial bones, which are the bones in your skull. These are the fibrous joint. So imagine puzzle pieces fitting tightly together. These joints don't move. Just like that, these joints don't move, which is important because they protect your brain by forming a solid protective case. Now let's talk about the joint between pubic bones in the pelvic girdle. This is called as cartilaginous bone. Okay, so think of it like a cushion or pad between two bones, allowing only a little movement. So this slight flexibility is important for activities like walking and in women we can say childbirth. So this is question number 10, and the question is fill in the blanks. We have given first statement, which is all mammals except a few have dash cervical vertebrae. Let's see the answer. The answer here is 7. Almost all mammals, no matter how big or small, have exactly 7 cervical vertebrae in their necks. This is true whether you are looking at tiny mouse or a tall giraffe. It's fascinating example of how certain features are conserved across various different species. So the answer here is 7. You can also see the picture of vertebral column, which is showing different regions, which is showing cervical vertebrae, numbers of cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, and sacrum. And at the end, we have coccyx, or we can say tailbone. What's really interesting is that this number, that is 7, stays the same for almost all mammals regardless of their neck length, which we have already talked about. For example, a giraffe's long neck is made up of 7 very elongated vertebrae, just like in humans. This shows us how basic evolution can stretch or shrink bones, but also keeps the basic number same. There are also exceptions. First, manatees are an exception. These gentle aquatic mammals have only 6 cervical vertebrae instead of the usual 7. This is a rare case and shows how some species adapt differently to their environment. Another exception is that uh, it is about the two-toed sloth. Depending on the species, two-toed sloth can have 5 or 6 cervical vertebrae. This is quite unusual among mammals and is a part of what makes sloths unique in the animal kingdom. Finally, three-toed sloths can have up to 9 cervical vertebrae, which is the most among mammals. So while 7 is the standard, these exceptions remind us that the nature is full of surprises and adaptations. Let's remember these unique cases as examples of how evolution can sometimes bend the rules. Now this is statement 2, and the statement is the number of phalanges in each limb of human is. So talking about phalanges, these are the bones in our fingers and toes. So the number of phalanges in each limb of human is 14. Each limb, whether it's an arm or leg, has 14 phalanges. This number might surprise you, but let's see you how it's distributed in our hands and feet. So remember, phalanges are the bones that make up our fingers and toes. So you can see in this picture phalanges of toe and hands, and their total number here is 14. So you can see, uh, talking about phalanges of hand, we can see carpal, metacarpal, and phalanges, which we already talked about. So these are fingers. Now in phalanges of toe, you can see different regions: tarsal, metatarsal, and phalanges, or we can say fingers. And we also have different regions here. So let's break down the number for one limb, whether it's hand or foot. We will look at the thumb or big toe first, and then the other fingers or toes. Let's break it down. First, the thumb or big toe has two phalanges. So think of the thumb as being bit different from other fingers. It's shorter and only bends at one joint. The same goes for big toe, and this is why they each can have only two phalanges. Now the other four fingers or toes each have three phalanges. So that's three bones per finger or toe multiplied by 4, which gives us 12 phalanges. So you can wiggle your fingers and count the joints to see how these bones are arranged. Adding it up all together, we have two phalanges on the thumb or big toe plus 12 in other fingers or toes, making a total of 14 phalanges in each limb. And this pattern is same for both hands and both feet. Remember, understanding these numbers help us appreciate how our bodies are structures for movement and motion. Now this is statement C, and it is thin filament of myofibrin contains two F actins and two other proteins, namely dash and dash. So the thin filament is a which is we already learned about it. Actin is a key part of how our muscles contract and relax. Let's see the answer in detail. So the answer is that the thin filament contains two F actins along with other two other important proteins, that is troponin and tropomyosin. These three proteins work together to control muscle contraction, almost like a lock and key system that decides when the muscle can move. So remember these names, they come up often in muscle physiology. Here's a diagram to help you visualize what we have just discussed. Here you can notice how the actin, tropomyosin, and troponin are arranged along the filaments. So diagrams like this are very helpful because they show us how these proteins fit together almost like pieces of puzzle inside our muscle fibers. Let's focus on actin first. Actin is the main component of the thin filament, and it forms two long twisted strands. So you can imagine this way, two ropes here twisted together. These actin filaments provide the backbone for the other proteins to attach to, and they are essential for muscle movement. The next is tropomyosin. This protein is like a long rod that lies along the grooves of the actin strands. Its job is to cover the spots where myosin, that is the motor protein, would attach, kind of like a safety cover that prevents unwanted muscle contractions. Finally, we have troponin. Troponin is a small complex made up of three proteins, and it sits on top of the tropomyosin. When the calcium ions are present, troponin changes shape and moves tropomyosin out of the way, allowing muscle contraction to happen. So these three proteins, that is actin, tropomyosin, and troponin, work together to control when our muscles contract and relax. These teamwork is what let us move smoothly as well as efficiently. This is statement number 4, and the statement is in a muscle fiber, calcium ion is stored in. So we have already talked about it. In a muscle fiber, calcium ions or Ca++ are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or we can say this is storehouse of calcium ions. So you can think of it as a storage room for calcium ion, holding into calcium until it's time for the muscle to contract. So this release and storage of calcium is what allows our movement, or we can say what allows our muscles to move. So you can see the picture of sarcoplasmic reticulum of muscle fiber. Now the sarcoplasmic reticulum is actually a specialized form of the sarcoplasm or of endoplasmic reticulum, but it's only found in muscle cells. Okay, so this is a type of, or you can say this is a kind, this is endoplasmic reticulum of muscle cells. So think of it as highly organized warehouse designed specially for storing and managing calcium ions, which are essential for muscle function. Now, calcium ions are kept in high concentrations inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When the muscle receives a signal to contract, these ions are released onto the muscle cell, triggering processes like contraction. So, the sarcoplasmic reticulum acts like a reservoir, making sure calcium is available exactly when the muscle needs to move. Let's remember, without this system, our muscles wouldn't be able to contract properly. Now, this is statement 5 of fill in the blanks, and this is dash and dash are pairs of ribs that are called as floating ribs. So they are asking about number of floating ribs. So the answer is 11th and 12th pair of ribs. These are known as floating ribs. So remember, these ribs are special because very special because they don't connect to the front of the chest like the others do. So you can see the picture, the structure of ribs. Here you can see 1 to 7 are called pairs of ribs are called as true ribs. Then 8 to 10 pairs are called as false rib. And talking about floating ribs, there are two pairs here which are called as floating ribs, that are 11th and 12th pair. So why do we call them floating ribs? It's because the 11th and 12th pairs only attach to the spine at the back. They don't connect to the sternum, or we can say breastbone at the front like the ribs, other ribs do. So you can think of them as shells that are only fixed on one side. To sum up, the 11th and 12th pairs of ribs are called as floating ribs because they only connect at the back and are free at the front. This unique structure helps protect the organs at the back of our abdomen, like the kidneys. So let's remember this special feature of our rib cage as we move forward. Now this is statement F, and this is and the statement is the human cranium is made up of dash number of bones. Let's see the answer. So the human cranium is made up of 8 number of bones. It's important to remember that this number because each bone here has a specific role in protecting the brain and shaping our head. Just like pieces of puzzles, these bones fit together to form a strong protective case. So you can see the structure of cranial bones. You can see the components. You can see frontal. We have one frontal, one sphenoid, one ethmoid, one parietal, two temporal, two parietal, and one occipital. So these are main components of cranial bones. Talking about frontal bone, which is only one in the cranial bones, it forms the forehead. Talking about parietal bone, which is uh, which is two in cranial bones, paired bones that forms the sides and roof of the cranium. Now temporal bone, which are two in number, these are paired bones located at the sides and base of the skull. Talking about occipital bone, which is one in number, forms the back and base of the skull. Moving on, we have the sphenoid bone. This is a single butterfly shaped bone located at the base of the skull. It's complex and it is very complex and helps connect several other bones together, acting like a keystone in a archway. Moving on to ethmoid bone, which is one in number, forms part of the nasal cavity roof and is situated between the eyes. So that's all for today's session. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope this lesson was useful.